implementation story of a PID. So that should be interesting. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you for having me. I'm just going to start my slide. Okay. Can you see the slides now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. My name is Untitled, and I'm the data curation manager of DATICE. It's the Icelandic Icelandic social science data service. We're a fairly new data repository. So the last year or so, we've been developing various aspects of our service, including our technical infrastructure. And one important task there was to, this year, was to implement persistent identifiers, or PIDs, for our datasets. And that's this, I'd like to share some thoughts with you today on that process. Okay, but just a little bit, before I start, a little bit about who we are. DATICE, we're a data service and archive for Icelandic research data, established in late 2018. And we're located at the Social Science Research Institute within the University of Iceland. Our main goals are to make Icelandic social science data findable, accessible, and usable, whether it's for research, teaching, or public policy making, and to ensure availability of high quality data for the research community and the general public. And we're the official service provider for Iceland in CESTA, the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives, as appointed by the Ministry of Science, Education and Culture. And thus we follow international standards and best practice guidelines on open access to research data. One important guideline or principle, as we know, are the FAIR principles. And we have, and one important aspect there is that we should have persistent identifiers or PIDs for our data sets in order for them to be findable or discoverable. And we chose to use DOIs as a persistent identifier for our data sets. And of course, that's a commonly used PID around the world. We decided also we had to decide on which registration agency we wanted to use, and we decided to make an agreement with GESIS Leibniz Institute in Germany. They have an excellent registration service called DARA, and we have great relationships with GESIS, and I'm very happy with that service. So we made an agreement, license agreement with them earlier this year. And that agreement is called the service level agreement. And this agreement, when we, this agreement really describes the responsibilities of DARA as a DOI registration service, and then our responsibilities as a data service. So just briefly, I'm not going to go into details about this agreement, but briefly, more or less, DARA supplies us with a way to register DOIs for our data sets and to edit the associated metadata. So we always have access to the data, can edit it afterwards. And it also stores our metadata. And of course, connects the DOIs so they resolve to the landing pages which we specify. And our responsibilities, mainly as the data service, is to, of course, to provide relevant and accurate metadata, but also to make sure that the URLs lead to the correct landing page. And so this is one of our responsibilities. We have access to this through, we can edit these URLs through various means, which I will cover in a bit. Just briefly, when we made the licensing agreement or the agreement with GESIS, we were asked to decide what kind of a structure our domain names would have. And a domain name is divided into 3 parts. There's a proxy, prefix, and suffix. And we were assigned a prefix, which of course starts with a 10 and a dot, and then this following number, which is our number 34881. But then what we had to decide was a system for our suffixes, and this could of course be almost anything, any string, and it's a quite flexible how you specify this. Could be a random number or some letters, and we decided to that each number would that this would be a very simple system that we'll be using. So we just have a 6-digit number sequence, which starts with a single number and a dot, and then followed by 5 numbers, counting from 1 and upwards. You could argue that you would maybe in some cases, of course, you would want to use a more sophisticated system, but we decided to keep it really simple. And the reason why we chose the 1 in the beginning is that just to offer some flexibility. For instance, if we wanted to differentiate between data sets on versions, like if there's a new version of the data set, which needs a new DOI number. And of course, we could also have had that 1 in the end, but we're not going to build up a very sophisticated system around this, we thought, so we just decided to keep it simple, counting from 1 and upwards. Or of course, you could do this anyway. You feel is right. And here is the web interface that is supplied, which you get access to through Data. And here you can create the metadata. You can input the metadata in and link it to a special DOI number and then to a landing page. And you fill in all the necessary metadata information. And you can also edit it afterwards. Let me point out that you can also upload an XML format, and so you can, that of course is considered more efficient. And if you are publishing a large number of data sets, I would recommend you go this way. But unfortunately, we have been not unfortunately, but we decided to start filling in all the metadata information manually this year. But we've been working on trying to streamline the process. So we will be, in order to be able to use our time more wisely and also to be more thorough in the process. So when you enter the web interface, this is similar. This is a Dara web interface, and in a way it's similar to the Fabrica web interface that Helena mentioned earlier. And here, mainly, if you have to fill in the basic information about the study or the data set, its methods and description. And of course, you can add publications there also on the right. And what we have found when discussing this and introducing this registration process within our university, that a lot of people gasp and think, oh, this is a lot of information that we need to fill in. But basically, that's why we're recommending that people use templates or various methods to make this process more easy. So you have all the information at hand, then this is more or less a copy-paste process. And usually researchers have most of this information. For example, if they have been applying for grants or doing a research, some plan. So this is what we point out very often when people kind of get anxious that they have to fill in metadata. But these are the metadata, some of the metadata that we are recommending and are filling, which we fill into this form. And further down the same page, there's here you can input your DOI number that you want to have, the suffix that is, and also the landing page. So if you take an example here, this is an Icelandic, it's a survey on voting in the national elections 2017. And so that's the URL for this survey. And then we have a landing page. We've been working with this, the landing pages are just simple HTML files. This has just, we had to, this has had to be, well, this was a way just to present the metadata temporarily. So you see both that you can download the files on top, and then you can access the metadata as well as documentation. It's not the most optimal way to do this, especially if your aim is to make your data machine actionable. A temporary solution this is. We also have been working with Nestor, and in theory we could use Nestor as a landing page for DOIs, but we haven't. We've mainly been using that to supply our users with methods to analyze and have a look at the data online. But we are now implementing DATICE. So we're changing over to DATICE, and that's I could recommend using this software platform. It's quite nice, and we can register the DOI numbers through this platform. So we don't need to go and input a lot of information into different softwares or websites. So we can register the DOI with DATICE, DATICE, and then specify the sub pages for each data set within DATICE as a landing page. And of course, by using DATICE, as Andreas talked about earlier, this kind of seems to raise the level of machine actionability. There's something good happening within DATICE, I guess, and it's a very nice platform. Okay, in the end, here are some things to consider before implementing DOI numbers. This is something that is good to ask yourself before starting. Which metadata should I include? Do you need to follow certain metadata standards? As we do as a member of CESTA organization, we at least have to register metadata according to the DDI standard. So that's a requirement. And then it's also good to think about whether you can include any additional metadata. And so to think about that beforehand. For instance, if we were to be part of the SESTA data catalog. I think we need to have extra metadata and register extra metadata for our DOIs about geospatial location, for instance. So that's good to know. And we're going to start doing that from start. And also which language are you going to use for the metadata? And of course, this is something that we had to think hard on. We're a small data service, and Icelandic is a language spoken by only 340,000 people. And so, of course, it would be excellent if we could translate and at least have all our metadata also in English. That's a goal for us. So that's something you should also think about. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important to make the workflow as efficient as possible. For example, by using XML documents and posting them. So you're not doing the same work twice or more often. And this has been an important topic at our office for last month. And then how will I organize and collect the metadata? I'm thinking collecting the metadata, I mean collecting it from potential data depositors or from your institution. So you have all the necessary data when you start registering DOIs. And I said we decided to have two templates, data documentation template, which would be it's an Excel or Word document, which collects information about a study. So it's all the basic information you need for a DOI registration, but also all the information for the accompanying documentation. So it's good to be organized from start and offer your staff or people who visit your website this type of template, so they can just start filling in already in a systematic way. And then, of course, we could also have a metadata template, a simpler template, which just contains the basic metadata that you need without the documentation. So we're thinking about offering these different types of templates. Okay, I think I managed to do this in time. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions?
Thank you. Yeah, we have one question from Richard Dennis. So he is curious to know how CCAN can compare to the rest when Dataverse seems to be the data repository of your choice.
How, sorry,
CCAN?
CCAN.
Yeah.
I must admit, I'm not that familiar with CCAN.
That may be a question for me, actually.
Yeah.
As I listed it in my presentation. Yeah, I can't really answer that question either, because you know, the sample we have with evaluated repositories, there are maybe only two CCAN repositories, and it's too small of a sample to really say any qualitative about that. What I did say was that you know, that these platforms for archives, they seem to at least help in making the data a little more fair than the average repositories. So I can't really answer whether CCAN is any significantly different than Dataverse. I wouldn't think so, but.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the chat as well from Charles in Berlin. Where are the data sets and accompanying documentation registered / described in your Dataverse, deposited / stored?
Where are they stored? Yeah, we it's on. You have to have of course a server, so they are linked to one of the servers. In I think we'll have 2 servers at the university. And let me add that DataVerse, it looks, it's quite simple to use and uploading and inputting metadata, but it's quite well complicated to set up. So we have had technical assistance from our IT department of the university. That's very important. It's not something you do over over a weekend unless you are skilled in computing. But I hope I answered the question. We have it's stored on a university server, a secure one.
I can perhaps ask another question. So Helena talked about mandatory and recommended metadata for the data sites. So, and you had a list there of what metadata you are recommending your users to provide. But how much of the data site recommended metadata are you recommending or using?
Yeah, the list, the metadata list on my slide was, I think it was not, it was examples. I think it was maybe most of the metadata that we're registering. And it's according to the DDI schema, and then other well, it's actually the data schema that we're using. I think that goes a little bit beyond DDI. And so this is some, and in DataVerse, I think the necessary metadata that you need to fill out is quite limited, and then you can decide to fill out an extra set of metadata specialized for the social sciences. Yeah. That's what we choose to use. That's similar to data because we're working within the social sciences.
But I think it is a point worth repeating. Helena talked about this in her presentation, that when you register a DOI, then you are required to provide some metadata, and you may provide further metadata, and these metadata are to a larger extent fair than I mean, they're basically fair because they use metadata standards to describe the content, and so by using this DOI service, you're basically also verifying your data to an extent. And so the way that we included this in our fair assessment study was that for those that have DOIs or handles, another type of persistent identifier, we evaluate first these 10 data sets on the repository itself, and then we measure assess the fairness of the DOIs or the handles that are equivalent to those, and so we just average over that. So typically, what we see is that there's a substantial increase in the FAIR score when using particularly DOIs. And this is thanks to DataCite, who is providing this metadata, as Helena mentioned.
Okay, thank you, Andreas, for clarifying that. Do we have any further question before we move on to the last presenter of today? I would suggest that you unshare your screen so that the next presenter can share his, please? Thank you. So, okay, I guess we can move on to the following presenter, who is Mike Nason. He is a scholarly communications and publishing librarian from the University of New Brunswick Libraries in Canada. So thank you for joining us. Very nice to have you here, especially due to the very inconvenient time for you. So please, Mike, go ahead when you're ready.
Hey, can everybody hear me? Are we good?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, it is blisteringly early for me, but it's fine. I have 2 coffees. I'm double fisting this morning. I'm gonna try to get through hopefully cogent presentation on persistent identifiers. So listening to a little bit of the prior conversation, and obviously I only really heard that piece. I think this will be sort of well in line with the conversations you folks are having today. So I'm just going to switch over to presentation mode, and I assume everything is as it should be. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. I'm going to give what I believe to be a pretty brief primer on persistent identifier context, organizations, and open infrastructure. This presentation was done not too long ago for an organization called CRKN in Canada. That's the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. And it was in the context of Canadian initiatives in this space. So I think a lot of this is actually pretty transferable. But if there are any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat while we go. I'm pretty easygoing there, and we can discuss these pieces. I'll just introduce myself quickly. So I'm Mike Nason. I'm a scholarly communications and publishing librarian at the University of New Brunswick, which is in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. And I also work for the Public Knowledge Project. You may know them as the folks who make Open Monograph Press and Open Journal Systems and a handful of other publishing software stacks that are open source and free. They're a really great organization, and I'm really happy to work with them. And in my role with them, I also I work as their Crossref and metadata liaison. So I do a lot of work with Crossref, who are one of the major DOI registration agencies for publications. So I spend a lot of time in the DOI space, and I was just reminded. And it's kind of funny, but in North America, we typically just say DOI. And the first time I heard somebody from Europe say DOI, I was very confused because in sort of a colloquial way, DOI just means like, of course. So somebody was saying, DOI. I was like, I'll be saying DOI, and hopefully that doesn't throw anybody. So yeah, I've never given a talk this early. It's obvious that the caffeine's starting to kick in. But we're going to go through this in a very quick way that's hopefully comprehensive. So before we dig in, I want to make one thing super clear, and I think we're already kind of addressing this in the prior talk. Persistent identifiers are in the very drinking water of scholarly publishing. They're kind of throughout all of the publishing infrastructure that we see. If you're at an institution, for example, that has what we refer to as a CRIS, or a research management system, they're pulling information from DOI registration agencies regularly. It's part of how they populate those systems automatically. Stuff like ORCID, the Crossref schema from the Crossref API, the DataCite schema from the DataCite API. A lot of this stuff may seem kind of secondary to a lot of people who publish, or it may seem new or not super useful to them. But behind the scenes, this stuff is vital. And it's a part of sort of the open infrastructure of scholarly publishing that's really easy to ignore. It's kind of like the plumbing of publishing and research sharing. So just a note at the beginning to think about this, that persistent identifiers are really sort of flowing throughout all of the work that we're doing in this space. So let's review a couple things we know based on some of the conversation you folks had today. PIDs are unique IDs that we assign to an increasing number of things. So institutions is one, data sets, people, organizations, articles, monographs, serials, all common things in which to put DOI on, or a persistent identifier of some kind. Persistent identifiers should or can make locating and tracking materials and research easier. It's kind of the promise of a persistent identifier, right? You see a DOI, you click it, it always takes you to where that content lives. So it's an easier way to get to the content. I talk to faculty all the time at my institution. They'll say, you know, we had this faculty page with all of our publications and they were all links directly to the publications, but the publications moved, or that publication is now defunct, or this was a project with the government or something, and all those links are dead. But if you have DOIs and they've been properly updated and registered, then they take you back to the content. So that's kind of the basic understanding, is that that's an easier way to locate and track your materials than a URL. URLs are, you know, one place that you don't really control, but a DOI can be updated and controlled over time. Persistent identifiers are great for disambiguation and consistent metadata. And this is kind of the biggest one, especially for ORCID, because we know that there are a lot of issues with metadata. And this was kind of brought up before. You know, trying to make your metadata match the DATICE requirements, the DATICE recommendations, probably means your metadata is going to be better than if you made your own schema and recorded your own content and uploaded it that way. And we know that there are a lot of issues with metadata. For example, names aren't unique. My name is not super common, but Mike is very common. And if I meet another Mike Nason, and I certainly get email from other people who think that they are me on the regular, you know, if that person's publishing and I'm publishing, now I have to disambiguate my work from their work. And that can be hard to do in, say, search engines or link resolvers or any of these places. So names are unique. Names don't follow rules. I think in sort of a Western sense, we kind of anticipate that names will do sort of first name, middle name, last name, but we know that that's not the case. We know that sometimes people only have one name. We know sometimes people have, say, transitioned and they don't want to have their prior name. They don't want to be dead named in their work, so they want to translate their name to their new name for their identity. Sometimes people get married. There are all kinds of reasons that names change and that names don't follow standard first name, middle name, last name expectations. Obviously, URLs change. And then places, people, and institutions are identified in myriad ways. So you think about the institution you work at and the number of ways that institution is referred to. So I'm at the University of New Brunswick. We have two campuses. I'm in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and there's another campus in St. John, New Brunswick. So my institution may be referred to as UNB, UNB-FR, UNB Fredericton, UNB-SJ, UNB St. John. Technically, they're all one institution, but there are all of these different ways in which they're identified. And when all of that content's getting pulled into a variety of systems, each of those may look like a distinct institution. So an identifier, a unique identifier for UNB, means that all of that stuff gets properly attributed to the one institution. Judicious application of persistent identifiers and the sort of ubiquitous uptake therein could save people a huge amount of time. You think about an ideal situation. I say ideal, it really depends on your political stance, I guess. But an ideal situation, everything would have its own persistent identifier. So each researcher would have an ORCID account, and then you would be able to constantly rely on those things. And then, you know, if you're applying for grant funding, for example, and all of your work is in ORCID, you could just supply an ORCID ID and all of your work could get sucked into the grant application platform. That would be great. That would be a really easy way to do that. And then if all of your work also had a DOI, then all of that work is easily accessible from your ORCID account. So you could just kind of get between all of these things in a much more easy and reliable way. And because the metadata you're registering is attached to that DOI, when you pull that content up, you also get all the metadata. You have access to all of the metadata associated with it. So I don't know if this is the case for folks at your institutions, but here we have a lot of faculty members who every year they have to fill out grant applications, and every year they have to write all of the publications over and over and over, and they're constantly kind of putting their stuff in a number of forms, and then they have to submit review to the institution itself, and they're always kind of duplicating their effort. And if you just had all that stuff in ORCID and you could pull it all down, that means they only populate it once. And even that's kind of mostly automatically populated. So there's, you know, good reason for people to be excited about persistent identifiers. Let's review some things that are less well known about persistent identifiers. PIDs are tied specifically to registration agencies who collect and distribute that metadata publicly. So when people talk about DATICE or Crossref or Handle or ORCID, those institutions, they all use a persistent identifier. They also all have their own schema. And they also often, I don't know about Handle, but the majority of them make that metadata accessible publicly in one way or another through what's known as an API. So people can hit that API and pull data from it. Most of the places do this for free. Crossref has talked about potentially having to charge for people who do this in a big way, like publishers, but this kind of stuff will be freely available. And those registration agencies handle most of the work of the management and other things. Sometimes people think that you just kind of mint a DOI, let's like create, mint a DOI, and then that's it. But if you don't register it, that metadata doesn't go anywhere and it won't resolve with DOI.org, who are sort of the overlaying organization. Registration agencies use different and variably compatible metadata schema. This is important to note too. So for example, you folks are talking about data sets and data site. Data site is broadly known as the go-to for data sets, for your minting DOIs for data sets. And they have a really great schema for data sets. And I know from talking to Crossref that their schema for data sets is not great. These two are not interchangeable. But on the other hand, DataCite doesn't have a super great schema for articles, and Crossref does. And they actually kind of point their users at each other. They say, well, if you're going to do articles, probably you should be registering your DOIs with Crossref. If you're going to do data, you should be putting your DOIs in DataCite. And these things aren't always one-to-one compatible. A DOI schema on one end is not going to always work fully with another schema. Persistence is purely a matter of service. I want to highlight this. I think a lot of people think of a DOI as almost like a preservation maneuver, that the DOI will always resolve to where the content is. This is kind of true, but if the website disappears forever, the DOI isn't going to resolve there. Also, if the user doesn't update the metadata associated with the DOI, let's say I move my content to another place, but I don't update the registration for the DOI, it also will not resolve. They're not smart or capable of automatically updating based on where content goes. So persistence in this case is really about what the identifier is. It's not about access to the content. And that's a really important thing to know about persistent identifiers. I think a lot of people think that you'll always be able to get to that content. And there are services that do. There's a service called perma.cc, which I just learned about, that will do like archiving of material, and then it assigns a persistent identifier while it does it. It seems to be used predominantly by people in law publishing who obey a totally different universe of rules that I don't understand. I don't know how it's even legal copyright-wise. But there are ways to do that, but typically persistence in this case really requires that thing to be updated by users or publishers or whomever. Persistent identifiers aren't meant to be human readable custom URLs. This is a big one. A lot of people who start using DOIs really want the back half of a DOI to represent their institution and information about the publication. That's kind of what Bitly is for. DOIs aren't for that. So they really just should be unique identifiers. And the more people try to customize them to make them resemble the content that's registered at them, the more problematic it gets and the more work and headache it becomes for the people who are using those DOIs. So, DataCite, for example, we run that at my institution. You have the ability to automatically configure your suffix generation. Some schools would put their school initials in that suffix. We don't, but some do, because they want that DOI to look like it's going to an institution. I don't think that that's sensible, but some people do that, and it's kind of best as a recommendation to avoid it. And just let them be completely unique strings of characters without having to have identification in them. There are many registration organizations and types of PIDs. So we'll walk through some of these. Institutions are predominantly identified by ROR, that's the Research Organization Registry. They're pretty new. They've just kind of started up not too long ago. You have GRID. ROR pulls data from GRID. And GRID and ISNI are both pretty similar. So those are the three big identifying agencies for institutions. You have researchers, so ORCID, and then ISNI is sort of compatible with ORCID in general. You also have Scopus ID and Web of Science Researcher ID. And obviously those two are a little bit different because they're publisher services, they're not open. So ORCID is kind of the big one for researchers that people use. It's open and free for most folks. You have Crossref. So Crossref handles articles, proceedings, monographs, data sets, and I put a little asterisk there indicating it can do them, but it's not great at them. Funding agencies, grants, reports, standards, and preprint. They basically, and I think, yeah, conference proceedings is here. Yeah, that's more or less exhaustive, but they've sort of been working on their schema for a very long time, and they have a lot of things that they can support. DataCite, software, data sets, collections, audiovisual collections, events, and models. So that's sort of their side of the coin, the sort of things you register with DataCite. All of these platforms either pull data from or push data to this open pipeline of metadata that I talked about before, the water supply. And they do that with what's known as an API, which is called an application programming interface. For those who have heard this word, and I've heard this word for a long time too, it's basically just a set of instructions. So an API, if I run a system and it has an API, it's a set of instructions to other people on how to get content out of the system I've built or put content into the system I've built. So when someone says something has an API, it really just means you can interact with that database of material. Most of these organizations are not for profit. Also, what's worth noting, obviously not Scopus or Web of Science. They have many dollars, but most of the rest of these organizations are not for profit. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of how persistent identifiers end up getting used. And one is very Canadian. I'll try to maybe translate it. We'll see how well that goes. So let's pretend, for example, I'm setting up my ORCID account as a researcher. I want to add my publications to ORCID. Within ORCID, I can check against the Crossref and DataCite APIs for any publications matching my name. It's as easy as adding a publication, selecting Crossref or DataCite, searching my name in their API, and it'll pull up anything that I've ever published that matches my name. And then I have to select the ones that I want. Most publications assign DOIs. It'll take me a while to do this the first time. And it'll only work if articles have DOIs. If they don't have DOIs, I'm not going to find them, obviously, in those places. And I'll be committed to writing those into my ORCID account by hand. But for all the publications I know that are mine that have DOIs, that metadata is automatically pulled into my ORCID account, which is a huge time saver because I've already probably written that metadata a million other places anyway. And here it is, ready to go with the link and everything else has been registered. And I probably didn't write all of the metadata. Publishers may have written a good chunk of it, stuff that I don't know, potentially catalogers at institutions. It may be more rich than what I initially provided and what I would be inclined to provide as a time-strapped researcher who can't spend all of their time writing, nitty-gritty metadata. And now that I have an ORCID, that metadata ideally is included whenever I publish, which means systems know who I am in advance. So now that I have an ORCID, if I'm publishing and I supply my ORCID to that publisher, they can pull my name metadata down. They can see my publication history. They include the ORCID where I publish. And that record is automatically going to be pulled into my ORCID account when I publish. I don't even need to queue it because it knows, oh, there's the ORCID ID. I'll pull that content in. I'll pull that DataCite or Dataverse link in. We'll make sure that all this stuff is in one account. And that's kind of happening like automagically, as we say sometimes, behind the scenes, but without having the user have to intervene. Let's try a more complicated example. So there's this platform, you've probably heard of one half of this, it's called Unpaywall. And Unpaywall is basically a plugin built by some of the folks who worked on another plugin called the Open Access button. And what Unpaywall does is when you're on a scholarly resource in your browser, you'll see a little lock on the side. And if there's an open access version of that material available, it'll provide you a link to it. And the way that they do this is they crawl a bunch of open scholarly infrastructure to see if a preprint or a postprint accepted or submitted manuscript have been posted to, say, archive.org or some other open place. And then they'll link to that content to get you the open version of that content. And Unsub is sort of a spin-off of that, where basically what they can do is they use that same open infrastructure and compare it against a university's collections allotment to let you know how many of your people are publishing in open access content, and if your faculty are publishing where you're subscribing. So you can kind of match up your subscriptions to your publications and get a sense as to where folks are publishing. So it allows you to kind of trim out things that you're paying for that you maybe don't need to pay for, or other things like that. So my institution is using Unsub to get a grasp on where my faculty publishes and how it matches our collection. And for us, it's just a data point. Unsub is created and maintained by only 2 people. And the software takes affiliation data from the Microsoft Academic Graph. I only just learned about the Microsoft Academic Graph recently, but it's kind of the technology that helps power things like Google Scholar. It's like a really powerful natural language processing system that scrapes scholarly publications and matches things like affiliation and authors and sort of does all of that work via AI. And then after that, open infrastructure does the rest of the heavy lifting. So Unsub takes that Microsoft Academic Graph information, checks against the Crossref API for ISSN and publications, provided collections that we give Unsub. It checks against Grid, it checks against Roar. And then it uses that data to tell you where your scholars are publishing. If it's open access, it checks against the directory of open access journals and scrapes for policies there. If the journals you're subscribed to are being published in. Without the Crossref API, this entire process disappears. Without the DataCite API, a huge amount of grant infrastructure completely disappears. Publications that aren't using DOIs are essentially off the grid. This infrastructure that's happening and pulling content or pushing content to or from, if you're not providing DOIs for your work, it's basically unseen. We used to sort of work really hard towards stuff like search engine optimization and making sure that our stuff showed up in Google searches and was accessible and searchable, or putting prominent links on our websites to this stuff. And increasingly, the more important piece is that you have and have registered persistent identifiers, because these systems are pushing this content back and forth consistently. Persistent identifiers allow us to see the big picture through all of these connections and interactions. And when we talk about supporting persistent identifiers, we're talking about supporting open infrastructure and the free exchange of metadata. We want to exchange this metadata because it means that we can know all the other places this stuff is being published. I think that's it. I hope that this was not too fast. I have a habit of talking too fast. I'm kind of wondering if the being very tired is kind of slowing me down. But hopefully it was not too fast to be useful. So yeah, if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this nice presentation. We have at least one question in the chat for you. That's from Richard Dennis. Do you have a website link to Unsub?
Let me see if I do. They're a pretty new service, and I don't know if they do any work with people outside of North America at the moment. It's just unsub.org. I will share the link in the chat. Everyone. But they are a very small, like I say, a very small organization. They spun off from the Unpaywall group, which was 3 people. Then 2 of them split off to write Unsub. But they are super, super friendly. They're based, one of them is based in Vancouver, Canada. And then I think the other is based somewhere in the States. But yeah, they've built this connection to open infrastructure.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Mike? I saw that there was another question also from Richard Dennis, but I guess was for the previous presenter, for Ernel Fur. It was about Dataverse. So he asks, does Dataverse support machine actionable data? That is metadata for machines, I guess, etc.
He also DM'd me that question because I shared a DataCite link.
Okay, so maybe it's for you.
I'm not
please
sure.
Do.
I'm actually unsure. That's kind of outside of my field. But I'm certain that the documentation exists because Dataverse is it was created by Harvard alongside DSpace. It's kind of meant to be the open data version of DSpace. They have a huge amount of open documentation and a really big user community. You can find a lot of that information on GitHub or on the Dataverse documentation website. And it's really, really rich information on how Dataverse works and its varying platforms. And they're consistently sort of updating developers on GitHub too. So if you want to keep up with new things that they're adding to the software, they're very transparent about what they're adding. Yeah, it's pretty good. But I would recommend reaching out to the developers on either GitHub or digging into the documentation, and I'm sure you can find the information you're looking for.
If I may add, also I can recommend the Google user group for Dataverse. They are quite fast in answering questions there, so you might try to address this over there.
Okay, thank you. If there are no further questions or considerations, maybe I hand it over to Bert to have some final remarks. Maybe you can, Mike, stop sharing your screen.
Oh,
please.
right, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, that's excellent. I will share my screen then for the last slides. I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is not bad, which is actually excellent. So yeah, I would like to say thank you very much to the participants also for being with us this morning, and particularly, of course, a great thank you to the speakers. I think it was most interesting what everybody had to say about this particular subject. I trust that all of you have now enough information to see also the relevance and the importance of having your repository being bindable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable through a global unique identifier. And what I would like to see, of course, is that you will either take action yourself, or that you will present this information and these requirements in your organization to your superiors, for instance, so that they will act on it. Of course, I would like to stress that if you need any help from us, for instance, from the people who have been on this call, don't hesitate to reach out. We are more than happy to assist. As I said earlier, this webinar was recorded. We will have all the slides available also for you if you want to reference them at a later stage. And I think that is it for me at this moment. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you again. And I enjoy, or I wish you a very nice lunch. And thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.